these black actors playing white characters or playing European actors is, of course, forced diversity. It's blackface. Where if Hollywood really cares about diversity, you can just make a period drama set in Africa, set in India, set in Asia. Why maintain a European setting, European characters, European politics, everything else, but just force black people into that role? It's blackface.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Rae. Welcome to another episode of the Caldron Pool Show. Really excited for today's guest. He is a writer, a blogger, and a podcaster. You might have seen him on Twitter. His name is Samuel Sey, and I'm really excited to have him on. We're going to talk about all things Hollywood, all things diversity, and a little bit of what's happening at the moment in Florida. So I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. I love Australians because you guys spell correctly. As a Canadian, I love reading reading your work because you guys spell it properly. Some of the Americans who can't spell things properly with their American English.
And I don't understand them, how they measure things. Like who measures things in Fahrenheit or yards or miles? I mean, that's just barbaric, to be honest. Like,
yeah, I've been struggling adapting to that over here in the U.S. because I'm Canadian. For those who may not know, Canadian, but now living in the U.S.
We will try not to hold the Canadian thing against you too much. There are some good things that come from Canada, let's be honest.
Yeah, very few things, but yes.
It's a bit of a battle at the moment, I think, between Canada and Australia. Like, which is the worst place to live?
Yes.
I'm not sure.
Yes. Especially during the lockdown era, it seems like Trudeau and the U.S., sorry, not U.S., but Australia and Canada were really duking it out to figure out which one would be the worst. So yeah, unfortunately, a lot in common in that way.
I think we win, to be honest, the Aussies.
Oh yeah,
I think we win, but it's interesting. I was speaking to some of the ministers in Canada with their experiences, and I thought, ooh, maybe they had it worse, like the $1 million fines that they had. We didn't have that because we were more compliant. But had we have not been compliant, perhaps we would have been in a similar situation.
Yeah. It was, in my mind, in the beginning, Canada probably was worse. And I guess even you can say maybe towards the tail end with obviously the fines and the Freedom Convoy, how, the frozen bank accounts, you can have those things. But Australia, man, some of the things I was reading really from you guys, Caldron Pool was just crazy. And I remember thinking that, Canada, we have it pretty bad, but in Australia, I think you guys have it worse there. So it's sad that we have to even compete on that level.
I know. Isn't this sad that this is like a sport now? But it's like if you don't laugh about it, you'll cry. So let's make a joke of it. But no, I think culturally speaking, we're quite similar though, Canada and Australia, more so than America. And maybe it's a monarch thing. I think we've always been under a monarch. So we view the government very differently to the Americans who view the government as, under God, whereas we view the government perhaps as God in the monarch sort of countries.
Absolutely. I remember doing research a few years ago about which nation was the closest culturally and politically to Canada, and Australia was easily number one. We are very, very similar historically. Even the Indigenous issue was very, very similar as well too across both nations. So absolutely, we have the most in common.
Yeah. Now, before we sort of get into the topics I wanted to discuss today, are you able to tell the audience a little bit about yourself? What got you into like commentating and writing and blogging? And you've just started your podcast recently, and just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So my name is Samuel Sey. So I was born in Ghana, West Africa. Then I moved to Canada, Montreal, the French side of Canada, and then eventually to Toronto. I was 10 years old when I moved to Canada. I was raised in a church, though, particularly the Pentecostal or even the Prosperity Gospel Church. So I was in the unbiblical movement. Really, actually, I know where you're at, really raised in that kind of Hillsong kind of, culture. But at 19 years old, the gospel that I'd heard finally, and it was rare, but the gospel would be preached accurately at times. And At 19 years old, I heard the gospel, and it was simply Christ died for sinners. And it was actually a female pastor, a heretical prosperity gospel teacher. But in that moment, she simply said, Christ died for sinners. And I just became born again, and I believed. And I mentioned that because obviously that changed everything about me. I was born again. I was a new person. Before that, I was a high school dropout. I had no desire for reading books or anything. Actually, I didn't read a book. I didn't finish a book till I was 19 after I became a Christian. And when I became a Christian, I just wanted to know the word of God. I wanted to study everything, history, philosophy, theology. And the more I kept reading, the more I wanted to write. But that didn't really come into fruition until 2015. You had the original Black Lives Matter riots. And it was happening in Ferguson in the US, but in Toronto, there was a Black Lives Matter chapter, which might be the most radical of all. And a lot of my friends, a lot of my Reformed Calvinist friends, many of them also being Ghanaian or Black, they were embracing Black Lives Matter. And I just couldn't believe that so many of my friends who had solid theology were embracing this so quickly. So I decided to study critical race theory, Black Lives Matter, so that I would be able to explain to them why these views, these ideologies are unbiblical. And I thought, instead of calling all of them over the phone to say, hey, here's why I'm worried about you, let me just create a blog, Slow to Write, which is a reference to James 1:19, let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And I created a blog really just to convince my friends, but I guess as some of them became convinced, not all of them, I can tell you that, but as many of them became convinced, they would share it on social media, and it just kept growing in Canada and then in the US, and by the grace of God, others across the world as well too. So that's how I started my writing, my blogging. And then just a month ago, I started my podcast, which is, also called Slow to Speak. It makes sense to just, slow to write. Well, let's make it Slow to Speak podcast. And I want to continue a lot of what I write about, but just now more through that medium, because blogging is still doing okay, but I want to reach out to the Gen Z people so that, because they don't like to read 5-minute articles. They want to, listen to 20 or hour long podcasts. So I figured, let me do that. So
it's definitely the way forward. Yeah. I think it's just the way that they've been raised very differently. It used to be picking up a newspaper and you would read it, and now it's watching the TV, and then the clips got smaller and smaller and attention spans. But no, I'm glad that you're in there, that you're in the race, because I think that that's our future, is ministering to and shepherding the hearts of the younger kids to not make the same mistakes that our generations have made. So I'm glad that you're doing it. I'm encouraged by your testimony. And it's funny that you mentioned that it was a female pastor who's not a real pastor, but God uses the means to his ends. And that is a beautiful thing, because it is Christ who saves and not man.
Amen.
That's something that I think is really important for Christians to remember. I've often said it, I would not recommend Joel Osteen to Christians for theological discussion, but I don't doubt for a second that God has used Joel Osteen to save people's souls. I'd like to, when people say that, remind them that, it's Christ, not man, who saves, for sure.
Amen. And because of that, whenever people appeal to pragmatism to defend any ideology, I say, well, wait a minute. No, as you just said, God can use anything for good, but it doesn't mean that we defend anything, right? Correct. Is that we still have to recognize that just because some things have good results does not prove the nature of that thing, right? It can still be evil. So I learned that from a very, I suppose, early age in that way. So even when it comes to Black Lives Matter or critical race theory and some of the supposedly, now I can't imagine any good results coming from them, but even if there was something that someone could point to say, well, wait a minute, how can it be bad when they're doing this? I just say, well, I have a history of being, becoming a believer through a false teacher, and even in some ways being discipled by some of the people who were in the church. And it was a lot of bad theology that I had to unlearn, but there was a lot of good that that I received from them through God's grace. So what you're saying is very, very correct.
Now, I wanted to talk to you about your first episode on your podcast, which was Forced Diversity in Hollywood. You were referring to in your first show is Blackface. And you've mentioned here that what sort of was the catalyst for you being into this sort of space was the Black Lives Matter sort of movement. And so let's just go back to perhaps that and then lead into your first video. Because we had a similar situation in Australia where we have even fewer Black lives over here. I think it's our Indigenous population who identify, I think, as Black is less than 3% of our population. But in terms of like African heritage and family groups, it would be incredibly small. But we had people marching on the street, and it was interesting. It was during COVID and COVID lockdowns. We weren't allowed to protest the lockdowns. We weren't allowed to do that. But the state governments over here allowed the Black Lives Matter protests to go. And I think because a lot of it was done out of fear of repercussions of saying no. Yep. And I think a lot of the discussions around these things, people don't want to have out of fear of the mob and fear of the mob coming after them, because the way that these political, cultural discussions have been, I guess, marketed is it's either love or hate. It's either you're a racist or you're not a racist. It's either you hate the environment or you love the environment. There's just, it's just no nuance. There's no conversation. There's no discussion. So many people fear being labeled a racist when it comes to Black Lives Matter that they take a back seat and go, I'm not Black. I'm going to stay out of it. I'm not this. So the fact, I first of all, I'm encouraged that you can come from a relatable position, and you also are a godly man who has that perspective as well, which I really appreciated during those times as well. So how is it that you could identify very early on that movement was bad? Like, why do you think you could see that and perhaps other brothers or sisters in Christ were unable to see it at the time?
Well, it's because I'm awesome. No, I'm kidding. No, well, before I answer that, just to get back to something you were saying earlier, you mentioned how during the initial, the lockdowns and everything in 2020, they allowed all these protests and riots across the world. It was also true in Toronto, across all Canada and the US, obviously in Australia. And what's fascinating is even at that time, when people were scared to death about COVID, if you ask people in June, July, August of 2020, which would you prefer, to get COVID or to be called a racist? I guarantee you 99.9% of people will tell you they'd rather get COVID, even as afraid as that were, because being called a racist in our society today is the worst thing that you could be called for many people, because you get canceled. There's no redemption for that whatsoever. You have a chance. Well, we know very clearly that, getting COVID is not going to really, you have a very low risk of dying from it. Some people have through other, there's other things we can say about that too, but generally some people, very, very little in terms of the numbers, but still some people could get seriously sick or potentially die from COVID because of their immune system or whatever. But when it comes to being called a racist, there's a 100% chance, if it's a major topic, of course, in terms of if you're a celebrity or a politician, you get canceled 100%. You get killed essentially from being called that. So for that reason, so many people are terrified, and the government's also terrified of that too, which is why they would say that essentially racism is a bigger disease than COVID. And they were actually saying this at that time. So anyway, in terms of why I was seeing things differently, honestly, it comes down to something that I learned a long time ago from John MacArthur, who has had, and Vadi Bokum, but especially John MacArthur, because I knew about him before Vadi Bokum. And the question, and my wife says this about me, so I'm guessing it's true because, she's never wrong, until I say she's wrong anyways. No,
go the patriarchy.
But it's that I ask, what does the Bible say? I am not I recognize, especially knowing my youth and trusting in myself, how wrong I can be. At 19 years old, I thought I knew everything until I became born again. And all of a sudden, everything changed. I became a new person. And I realized I had to unlearn so much. I was raised in the prosperity gospel where when I became reformed, I realized I knew nothing about the Bible. I didn't understand God's grace. So it's taught me that I can't trust myself. I can't trust anything. I can only ask, what does the Bible say? So because of that experience, when I saw all those things, when I saw people reacting to the Ferguson riots, Black Lives Matter, all of that, my first question was, okay, what does the Bible say? And James 1:19, the reason why I made that my slogan, or the name for my website, is it's always been very important to me. I'm a very fast talker, and maybe hopefully less so now, but I can be very sure of myself in my nature. And I've learned that no, I need to be quick to listen. I need to listen to both sides, and then be slow to give an answer. And that's what helped me to have a different way of understanding the issue than so many of my friends.
I think anyone who knows me in real life knows I possibly have an issue of talking underwater as well. So it's definitely, this podcast has been super helpful because I am interviewing other people and I'm having to learn to be slow and to give other people somewhere to speak. And it's interesting when it's the other way around and I'm interviewed, people are like, oh, wow, I didn't know you talk so much. I'm like, it's so much self-control during the podcast where I'm like, no, let other people speak, Evelyn. But yeah. I do think it's a really healthy way to be. And it's a lesson I've had to learn and I'm continuing to learn, especially being in these online political spaces, because often something will come out and you'll be so quick to have a comment, to have commentary on it, to be the first take to think like this. And I'm learning, no, sometimes I just don't need to comment. I'm just going to wait in my wisdom on this. Yeah. So I think that's great.
And if I can say this too, maybe this is more natural. It used to annoy my mom, and it actually annoys my wife now, but I just naturally am a very curious person. I ask a lot of questions. I just want to know everything. I just ask questions. And when I was a kid, my mom was like, man, shut up. Why do you have to know everything? Just leave me alone. And my wife, sometimes I'll be asking her questions and she's like, I don't know. But I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? Think about it, right? So I say that because I think that natural desire to just understand things, to know things, to ask questions have helped me, because I'm not very smart whatsoever. But if you ask questions, you can sound smart, because just by asking questions, you'll be able to learn so much from what other people are really thinking. And I would basically ask questions from woke people and their answers wouldn't make any sense to me. And then I would ask questions from people who were anti-woke and their questions would seem better, but then I would go back and forth and just, so before I wrote my articles, I was truly studying for a year. And when I realized that a lot of people were not giving me questions that made sense, I just said, okay, let me really dig in myself. Let me read so many books from both sides and then figure out which makes sense, which is biblical. And so asking questions, as you've also suggested through the podcast, allowing people to speak for themselves has been really, really helpful for me.
Now, when you said that, it was basically Black Lives Matter wasn't biblical, and through waiting and obviously supplication and reading of the Bible, you came to that conclusion. Can you sort of give me, I guess it's probably a very long, extensive thing, but just like a summary or a concise reason as to why Black Lives Matter organization / movement you identified as being sort of unbiblical?
Yeah, there are many, as you said, there are many, not almost everything about them is unbiblical. One, it's even just, they lie about the numbers. They lie about police chasing down black men systemically to kill them. It's all lies. When I was looking at the numbers, it's not true. If anything, the cops were much more in danger from criminals than criminals,
I looked at that too.
Criminals. Yeah. Criminals were killing cops a lot more frequently than cops killing
Yeah.
black people. And then also have the ideology, which is of course is critical race theory. So what's fascinating is, well, critical race theory became a big topic in 2020, but critical race theory has been a major ideology on the left for a long time. And Black Lives Matter, they call themselves Marxists, but really it's race Marxist, or race Marxism, which is critical race theory. And their ideology basically says that white people are inherently oppressive and black people are inherently oppressed, which is racist against both white people and black people. I'm not oppressed just because I'm black. That's ridiculous. That's a very racist thing. If a white person says that, he's a white supremacist. But if a black person says that, he's woke. It's just stupid. So that's unbiblical. Obviously, their views on the nuclear family and how they really hate it. That really bothered me. So I've mentioned my mom, but I've not mentioned my dad. I grew up in a fatherless home, and I'm very passionate about how fatherlessness have destroyed black families across not just Ghana, Africa, but in the UK, in Canada, in America. It's a major problem that I really passionately want to be helpful. One of the reasons why I'm very heavily into the pro-life movement is because I know the connection between fatherlessness and abortion. So for a group that claims that Black lives matter, but you're saying that black fathers do not matter, when the father is the leader of the home, then you're essentially saying that all black people do not matter. If you don't care about the head, you don't care about anything. So that was very disturbing. And then, of course, they're also very anti-Christian. So in 2020, you had the Black Lives Matter riots, but actually just a week or two after the initial George Floyd riot started, they had a Black Trans Lives Matter rally, because they're heavily intersectional, they're heavily pro-LGBTQ. In fact, all their founders, including both in the US and Canada, and I think in the UK as well too, are all LGBT members. So and of course, they're also very pro-abortion. They've received awards from Planned Parenthood for their pro-abortion work. They're radically anti-Christian in every way. So they're very unbiblical, and that's one of the reasons why I oppose them.
Yeah, we had some ministers and things over here in Australia, basically saying that it was okay for us to be for Black Lives Matter, and they tried to have the theology behind it because of this. But like you mentioned, like so many of the statistics that are given are not factual. I know that from here as well, being in law enforcement. I can make statistics look like anything if I want them to. Like, let's be real. I can, and many government agencies do, and all the statistics lead and are purposed in one way, which is to be doom and gloom and to make things look very bad. And sometimes you need that, but sometimes they need that for their agenda. But the statistics in America, I looked into that because being a former police officer myself, I was curious what the actual numbers were. And if you look at how many police officers are in the population, I think it was whatever it was, and then how many Black police officers make up less than 2% of the population in America. So they're more of a minority group per se than African Americans. And there's more of them that are killed every year than there are, by cops killing people. And I remember going through the statistics, being blown away, going, where are they getting these numbers from? I don't know where they pull them from. And I have no idea how they come to their conclusions. Are you finding that there's like a disparity between statistics over there? Is one group saying the statistics are this and the other saying, no, the statistics are this? Or is it just a blatant lie?
It's a blatant lie, but there are some people who look at the numbers and they're also not looking at, as you said before, you can make numbers look like anything you want it to be sometimes. So I think for the most part, they're blatant lies, but there are some people who would look at the raw numbers and still paint it in a different direction. So, but one of the fascinating things is they'll oftentimes talk about the number of Black people killed by cops, and they would mention something like maybe 30, right? But that can seem very high, but then you look at the fact that almost all of them were actually like trying to kill cops. And if you're trying to kill cops, well, it's right, it's ethical, it is absolutely justified for the cop then to kill someone who's trying to kill them. It's just common sense. Even if you're not a cop and someone's trying to kill you, you have every right to defend yourself. And then you have the unarmed shootings, the unarmed killings of Black Americans by cops. That's usually around 9 or 10 every year. Actually, it's been going down over the last 20, 30 years. So you have that, but when you consider how, and even in those cases, the facts are disputable, or sometimes it may be, for example, that they may be unarmed, but they were not listening to the cops saying drop whatever you were holding. Sometimes it may not be a gun, but it might be a cell phone, and the cop is not sure what it may be, right? And he's saying drop your gun, or drop whatever you're holding, and they wouldn't do so. Or sometimes you've had people who've, even though they've been unarmed, have been attacking the cops. And so, for example, you had Michael Brown, the person who was killed by a cop, Darren Wilson in Ferguson. That's sort of the whole Black Lives Matter riots in Ferguson. He was unarmed, but and the evidence shows this, that he was beating up on the cop, and he was trying to get his gun to kill him. And the cop rightly then had to defend himself and shot him. So that would look like an unarmed shooting, but the cop was defending his life. And there's so many examples of that. So, and then of course, just to compare that, the shootings to white victims, which obviously tends to be a lot higher than it is for so-called Black victims. And then when you consider the fact that cops in the U.S., because of the high crime rates, especially in the urban areas, the number of interactions, especially hostile interactions they face, when you consider that you only have usually 9 or 10 unarmed shootings in the US, it's actually remarkable, because I'm forgetting what the numbers were, but the hostile interactions between cops and potential criminals were extremely high in the US. So when you look at those numbers, it's not a major issue. It's a fascinating thing too, by the way. Those numbers haven't changed at all, right? In 2015, really, or 2020. Why isn't that a big news now? There are still cases of unarmed Black men being killed by the police. And in any of them, a woke person could make some kind of an argument about how it was because of racism. But why isn't that happening now? Because there was a political reasoning behind 2015, 2016, obviously that was the election, and then 2020, also the election as well too.
It's interesting that they do seem to, like, these big movements, political movements, seem to coincide with something else happening in the background. It's very rare that it kind of happens without something else, and so you kind of can conclude rationally that, are they related? Is this somehow linked? Yeah, but it's interesting, you mentioned the statistics of the amount of interactions and things like that, and it's relatively low, comparing that. I looked at all of that as well, and I remember there's like millions of interactions that the police would have in a year period, millions. But this is the thing, right? You'd have to be a sociopath to want anyone to be killed, right? You would, like, especially when you're a Christian, there's such a reverence for life, all life. Like, I was talking to my family, we live on a farm, and we don't go hunting for fun for kangaroos or pigs, or like, that's just, each to their own. If people want to go hunting, that's fine. But for us and for my family, when we just have such a reverence for life, it's just not enjoyable even there. So, the thought of anyone losing their life should be abhorrent to all of us. We're all image bearers. We're all eternal souls. And, but it's unfortunately just pitted in such a way that if you dare say anything, or you must hate Black people, you must want them dead. It's like, no, those 9 lives is a tragedy that they were lost that way. It's a tragedy. Exactly. It's an absolute tragedy. But saying that it's pretty good that out of millions of, interactions, only 9, it just gets twisted in such a way. So people get so afraid to just have conversations about these things. Do you find something similar, that people are really scared to talk about these sorts of issues because of fear of the mob?
Absolutely. Fear drives so much of this. People just lose their reasoning. I've said this many times and it offends people. I remember actually during the 2020 riots, one of the most popular articles I wrote was, I think, a article titled "Dear Police Officers," and it was me sharing my admiration and respect for the police. I mentioned that I grew up without a father, but my mom remarried, and unfortunately, he was an abuser. He was beating her up and threatened to do worse to her. And a police, I was 11 years old. I couldn't do anything. I was completely just unable to help her. And a police came and, he saved my mom and kept her safe when I couldn't do so. And also just many other examples as well too, that I shared in our article of how the police have helped me. I mean, I moved to Montreal, the big city from Ghana. I got lost. And as a young Black kid, I had been told that I should never call the police because they could kill me. So I wandered around the city, a massive city, for about an hour or two, trying to find my home. I couldn't find it. And I finally just called the police and they took me home. And I wrote that article just to try to encourage some people that I knew who were police officers. I mentioned that though, because when a police officer wakes up in the morning, they just want to go back home afterward. They're not planning, they're not thinking they're going to be in the news and that worse that they could be, perhaps even justly or unjustly, have killed a person. As you said, you have to be a sociopath to want that. So when these cases happen so often, look, I'll say this. When I saw the horrible video of George Floyd, and I have unpopular views about that, which is not going to be a surprise for a lot of people, but I was saddened that a man lost his life. But I was also extremely saddened that I'm forgetting his name, that George Floyd, the cop, I'm forgetting, Derek Chauvin, yep, that he was surely going to jail. That really saddened me. And I also knew that no matter what you believe about this, he would not have a fair trial. He was done. And that made me sad for both lives. God calls me to show no partiality to anyone. I don't want to be partial against George Floyd or partial against Derek Chauvin. And unfortunately, in our society today, because of fear, people refuse to be impartial. And unfortunately, it just makes our society all the worse.
Yeah, I have a unique perspective because I came from law enforcement. So for me, there's this really strange camaraderie that you build. It's like men that go to war together come back with this bond that's, you can't really articulate or put into words. There's just this, you bleed together, you sweat together, you cry together, you just form, like during a crisis, like you form these bonds with people. So I had that, once you bleed blue, you always bleed blue. And so for me, seeing the rhetoric that all cops are bad apples was really hard, because I see and I've experienced the other side of the curtain, which is the trauma that line of work brings to you. I've had to pick dead bodies off the floor children. I've had to tell loved ones that they're never going to see, that the particular person again. I've had to arrest people I haven't necessarily wanted to. They've made one mistake in their life, but, they've got to see justice. And there's been so many people I've had to investigate that false allegations. I've seen it all, and it's really difficult job. And so I felt it was really unfair. But at the same time, I'm also in a position where I can be perhaps more critical of the police than others. And I feel like I should, because I think there are so many things that they get wrong. And I think that the organization is very godless, and they're recruiting police now who perhaps aren't necessarily the good guys that they once used to recruit. But that's a whole nother issue. But the reality is exactly as you said. As soon as everything happened, I was sad that George Floyd lost his life. And I was essentially sad that I knew that Derek Chauvin would not get a fair trial. That was just a given. Yeah. He had to be sacrificed to the mob, because what would happen if they even suggested that perhaps it was justified would just be too much for any politician, any police department, any media. Like, it's literally suicide if you agreed to have a fair trial. So that was very sad watching that sort of play out in real life time, and especially today when we should be getting better and progressing further as a society, not regressing with these sorts of ideas and things.
Yeah. And, you know, as you mentioned, progressing, well, this is what the media won't tell you. Things have gotten progressively worse now in light of this, where in Chicago, for example, I think only about 30%, maybe 40% of crimes against Black people are solved. No one talks about that. And what happens is the trust between cops and a lot of Black communities have been destroyed all the more. But the sad thing is the average Black person, not the woke person, but the average Black person respects cops, because when, especially in urban areas in the US or in Canada or, you know, anywhere, but when you live in communities that's filled with crime, you know that the cops are really the only hope for protection. So now that there's so much just distrust, it just makes things so much worse, where people are not comfortable talking to the police because of just the narratives about police officers.
Yeah, it's a downward spiral. It really is. I think it was, maybe it was Chicago. There was a female police chief who was a Black lady, and she came out and said that the calls, now that they're defunding the police, which was it's almost like they did the defund police to just appease the mob sort of thing. And in doing that, calls went from under 5 minutes response time to 19 minutes average. And just to put that in perspective, the human body can bleed out in under 5 minutes. So 19 minutes is just not good enough, right? But that's the inevitable result of a fracture between law enforcement and civilian. And especially, like you said, it's these vulnerable communities, these fatherless homes, these Black communities that will suffer more in the end in an effort to try and, well, I don't believe that that's their agenda to try and better it, but let's just go with that for a minute now. In an effort to try to better their communities, they're actually hurting themselves. And it's a horrible thing to see. And as well as I said this before, and I've said, and I truly believe this, if you want to make enemies with the police, you better start making friends with the criminals, because that's the world that will unfortunately happen. There needs to be great reformation in the police. There is absolutely no doubt. But defunding is not the answer. Look, anything that fails, what's the first thing that they do? Oh, education system's failing. Let's throw more money in it. Oh, this system's failing. Let's throw more money into it. This is failing. Let's throw more money in. Oh, the police are failing. Let's take money away. You're only going to make it worse. Crime's only going to be worse. The distrust with the communities is only going to be worse. And it'll be the women and the children, let's be honest, that will suffer the most in these communities. So it's very sad. Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting. As you've said, I'm not as knowledgeable as you when it comes to the police, but you're not going to find anybody, I think, any reasonable person who will say that there shouldn't be some kind of reformation. You could always improve on something. This is just a fact of life, right? There's no perfect system. But I find it incredible that we're so hard on the cops. And I understand part of it, right? It's because there is a natural lethal element to being a police officer. But you also have, I'm forgetting what the number was, but doctors or hospitals or healthcare workers are actually much more likely to kill someone than police officers. But you don't hear about that. Now, people would say, well, yeah, we wish we could change that and we should reform it, but unfortunately that just comes with the job, right? There's going to be accidents. So we're gracious with healthcare workers, but when it comes to the police, we're not gracious that sometimes there will be accidents, right? Now, of course, you also have people who are going to be evil in the police, and that needs to be addressed. But sometimes it's also okay to say, man, that's just a horrific accident, that this cop perhaps wasn't trained well or something else. And then instead of blaming the entire system in terms of all police officers being evil and corrupt, you know, instead of saying that, look, we can reform things. And also, even though we can reform things, in a sinful world, you're going to have accidents sometimes, and that's just the reality of our world.
Absolutely. And I think it's a trap that we all fall into. Even those of us on the right, we're not very gracious people. It's so, like we almost get enjoyment out of seeing other people suffer. And I think what it is like it's human nature to want affirmation. And instead of having to be personally responsible, what's easier than that? It's easier to point your finger at someone else and go, oh, well, they're worse than me. So it makes you feel, better about the position you're in. And it's something that I would love to be better at. And I actually had a moment like a couple of years ago, I would say, where I was really convicted to stop being such a hard woman online, particularly because I would just tweet something and I'd just go, on the breeze, off it goes, flying its little Twitter wings, and let's just see where this lands, right? Zero grace, zero tact, zero finesse. And I was really humbled about that. And I thought, I got to do better, especially as a woman with how I do things. But yeah, something I notice is there's just no grace offered on the left. There's not really much grace offered on the right. We are depraved human beings. We are born into sin. And I think that it would be such a good thing for everybody. I don't care what side of the political fence you sit on, to be more humble and gracious human beings on this earth.
Amen.
For sure.
Amen.
But I'll move into your first podcast. We've talked a lot about political stuff, and I guess this is political as well, but we can have a little bit more fun with this because I'm a bit of a movie buff. And we've had this conversation when we were organizing the podcast. We have very similar taste in movies and entertainment. So I thought this would be fun. But you did an episode, your first one, called Hollywood's Forced Diversity is Blackface. And I remember going, oh, this will be interesting. And I watched it and you went into a few different shows as examples and things like that. Basically, I'm gonna probably butcher this, but I'm gonna give the audience a little bit of a concise plot synopsis of your first episode, and then I'll get you to explain it further. So you were basically saying that, a lot of white people have been in trouble for blackface. Look at Justin Trudeau. That photo of him with blackface is just like, that was just like the nail, right? Like that's just been the biggest pebble in his shoe, right? That one photo. Yeah. And it seems to be something that you're just not allowed to do, right? And you're basically saying, but today Hollywood's doing that to white people. How did I go with that plot?
No, that's pretty good. See, now here's the thing. That I'm going to say that's pretty good. Now, even if I really thought it was awful, as you just said, I'm supposed to be gracious. So I'm just teasing with you.
Learn from me.
No, I'm teasing. That's pretty good. Yeah. So I just talk about how we have a hatred for blackface in our society, but Hollywood has really been implementing their own kind of blackface. So I think I started by explaining the history of blackface. It's basically with what was called minstrel shows from I think the 19th century in the U.S. I think in the UK as well too, where it would be white actors really just wearing black makeup to mock black people with stereotypes and things like that. So it would be white actors playing black characters, but really kind of mocking them. And I make the point that with Hollywood's forced diversity today, it's very much the same thing, but in the reverse, in that it is black actors really playing white characters. So they have black faces, but they're really just white characters. And I referenced, so I love period drama. And I always laugh when I say it because people wouldn't expect that, but I love the Jane Austen romantic. I'm a sap.
Your wife
love that stuff.
Won the award on that one.
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure about that one because I can be pretty pathetic. I think I was watching something.
At least you're honest with yourself.
I was like, yes. I was like, my heart is fluttering. I was just being weird. But I love that stuff. I mean, I think Sense and Sensibility is my favorite period drama. I love that stuff. So, look, I can tolerate a lot of forced diversity nonsense. I won't watch it, but I can tolerate that stuff. But once you touch my period dramas, now you're
There's a line.
Really,
The
there's a
line
line
has
that
been
you've crossed.
crossed. Yeah.
Yes. And there's this movie called Mr. Malcolm's List. And the plot is actually interesting. And I saw the cover and I'm like, oh no. You can just tell right away. It is they have all these black characters, these brown characters. Now, just so you understand the background, this movie is set in, I believe, the early 1800s. And you have black, brown characters, like many of them making up the bulk of the cast. And it's just not realistic. Now the cast, the characters are supposed to be high class, part of the elite class, and it just doesn't. It's just not realistic. There were a few people who were part of the class back then in the UK, but just wasn't the norm. But in this movie, they made it the norm, and I think they call it. I'm forgetting the word they use actually to describe the kind of casting. Basically, they're just saying that it is not realistic, but we just want to have these characters. We want to have this forced diversity in a period drama. And I just hated it because the whole time as I'm watching this plot, which is relatively actually good, I just can't take it seriously because it's not realistic. And I make the point that these black actors playing white characters or playing European actors is, of course, forced diversity. It's blackface, where if Hollywood really cares about diversity, you can just make a period drama set in Africa, set in India, set in Asia. Why maintain a European setting, European characters, European politics, everything else, but just force black people into that role? It's blackface. And that was really what I was saying.
Yeah, I think it's I think people have got this whole forced diversity fatigue at the moment. Like you said, you can tolerate things, and it really doesn't matter when, for example, someone is just better at singing or better at acting for this particular role, and the ethnicity or family group has no bearing on the plot or the time period or whatever. It's like, who cares if they're black, they're white, they're Hispanic, or who cares? Like, again, you would have to be a sociopath to view any other human being as less than a human being. So that's how I view it. Like, I love my family group. I love my family group's culture. I have this really weird desire to go to Europe and visit the place my father was born. And I have no idea why. I've never been there before. My father was adopted and came out to Australia. And there's just something in me that is so fascinated with that part of the world. And I think it's because I have this inherited desire to know where I'm from and to have this inherited love for my family group. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But that doesn't mean I love anybody as a human being or, seeing them as an eternal soul any less because of that. And so, I can tolerate things and I don't really care, right? But it just seems so forced now, and to the point where people who would be better at the job are missing out because of the forcing of it. And it's like, it's huge. I'm just fatigued from it. Look, to me, The Little Mermaid was the one that got it for me. And I know that might sound silly, but for me as a child,
it makes sense.
That was my movie. There are photos, and I'll show you these photos of me as like a little 5-year-old girl with the Ariel costume on. I wore it everywhere. I was obsessed with it. It was my absolute favorite. And we have redheads in our family with blue eyes, right? And that is their favorite movie, and they've grown up seeing that, and like, it's a character that they identify with. And so for me, when that happened, I was a little bit like, oh, okay, that's my nostalgia. That's just like your period drama, there's a line, and Ariel was the line. I could forgo other things, but for some reason, do you think people are just fatigued from it? Do you think that it's going to boil over at some point, or do you think this is just going to keep happening?
I think it will keep happening because I mentioned this in the podcast. There's an incentive now, Hollywood. So now you can't get nominated or win awards if you don't have forced diversity in there. It's really explicit. So they're really forcing the they're forcing producers and directors to really have a so-called diverse cast. So it's here to stay. And I despise that with a passion, because it takes me out of the movie. I love movies, man. I'm so enthralled by great stories. And when you have things like this, it takes me out of the movie. Right. And one of the things I mentioned in the podcast too is my favorite shows growing up were shows like Road to Avonlea. I don't know if you know Road to Avonlea. It is a Canadian show. It's a spinoff of Anne of Green Gables.
Oh, I love Anne
And
of Green Gables.
yes, yeah. So it's weird. I'm not really into Anne of Green Gables, but I'm into the spinoff show. I love that show. And it's the whitest show you could ever imagine. It is basically like is it the Waltons? I'm forgetting. It's maybe not Waltons, but I think it's I'm forgetting. There's a very popular American family show based in, like, I think the 1900s or something like that.
Is it Little House on the Prairie?
Yes, yeah, that's it. I think it's very similar
Right.
to that, and I loved it because it's really about young people growing up. I was watching it when I was young, or when I was like a preteen or something like that, and it's really just preteens growing up. So these are different kinds of people. They are white. It's set, they were in a small town. I was living in a big city, an immigrant Black person living in a big city. So they're a very different setting, set in the 19th century, but yet they were telling a simple, basic human story about preteens growing up and adjusting to life, especially, since I'm a sap, to, falling in love, right? It's a coming of age story, essentially. I also love The Wonder Years, very white show. I never felt that I couldn't relate to these people because they weren't like me. They were just telling a human story. They were just appealing to me as a human. So when you have forced diversity, you're really trying to say to me, oh, you can relate to these characters because they're just like you. But that's lazy. That's not good stories. The reason why, kids of all types love, whether it is The Little Mermaid or some of these Disney movies, it's not because of what they look like necessarily. Now that can play a role, right? As you mentioned, some people in your family just loving her as a character because they look more like her. That's fine, but it's also now there are plenty of characters who may look, also have red hair or green or blue eyes. I don't remember what our eye color was, but if the stories are terrible, you don't care, right? It's the stories that matter first. And then you can just say, hey, they have to look this way too. That's pretty cool. But if you make the priority what they look like, right? Their so-called diversity, you ruin the story. And I'm not I don't write fiction, but that too, but I love writing, right? I'm fascinated with that. And to me, it's just lazy writing, and it just takes me out of the movie. So as I'm watching this, this particular movie, Mr. Malcolm's List, I'm just like, man, I again, the plot in of itself is actually interesting, but it just keeps taking me out. And the worst thing too is in this movie, because they are trying to be, diverse, what happens is they actually ignore racism at that time. They ignore slavery at that time. So by actually ignoring history, they end up, of course, in a sense, whitewashing history. And then basically just ignoring the issue of racism that would have been happening at that time. So in a sense, by being so-called anti-racist, they become racist.
Yeah, I really love the point that you said about how relating to someone on a human being, and how it's just lazy to have to just solely rely on someone that looks like you. I love the idea because when I read books, something that I really gravitate to is characters I can relate to. I'm like, if I was a character, I would be that. I don't know about you, but whenever I watch like Lord of the Rings, I'm like, oh, I would be this character. I would be this one. And, you look at your family members, you're like, you'd probably be Gimli, or you'd be Legolas. And you're like, what? I'd be Aragorn. And you get, so it's seeing yourself in characters that makes you just get entrenched in that world. And like it is like based on mostly character and humanistic quality and traits sort of thing. So I liked that point. I was like, that's a really good, I hadn't thought about that, like put it out there, but it's so true to how we view things and entertainment and how we read and immerse ourselves.
Yeah. And you know, diversity in of itself isn't wrong, right? So long as it's natural. So not to keep promoting that particular podcast episode, but I mentioned that, look, I love Korean dramas. Again, I'm strange. My wife, I blame my wife for that one, but I don't watch the sappy ones. I watch actually the thrillers. They're actually very interesting. And I love them. We just finished one recently, and it was great. And I mentioned that there's this Korean drama that is uh, just brilliant. It's a story about one woman persevering. And long story short, there's a part where she has to say goodbye to her mother. And I won't lie to you, that got me emotionally because all I kept thinking about was that. Now, see, I'm getting a bit emotional now, is because I had to say goodbye to my mom, and my mom and I are tight. We're very tight. And when I was leaving Canada to marry my wife, it was a hard choice for
Mm.
me. My mom's a single mom, and she's been taking care of me my whole life, but I've been taking care of her too since I became an adult. And for me to say goodbye to her, and I never thought I would be leaving. I always thought I would just be living nearby her. And for me to now live several hours away, I haven't seen her for a year and a half. It
Mm.
was very, very difficult. So as I watched this Korean woman saying goodbye to her Korean mom,
Mm.
I was very emotional because I thought about my mom and how I was saying goodbye to her. It
Yeah.
was a very similar circumstance in the movie. My point is, they were just telling a good story about characters and about life, and it appealed to me. And I'm not a Korean woman. I mean, I can identify as such, I guess, but I'm not a Korean woman. Um,
Yeah.
and so that's just, again, you don't need, like, natural diversity is good, but forced diversity is just a mess. And I to me, it would be like, how far will you go with that? So if you make a movie about slaves, right, about African slaves, are you gonna have Korean actors playing black slaves, African slaves in there just so you want diversity? It's just absurd, right? Is
Mm.
No, just have these characters portray the people that they should rightly represent. Um, and as a Ghanaian, I remember Netflix produced a movie a few years ago. I'm forgetting what it's called, but it was a Ghanaian movie, and I was like, "Oh wow, that's great!" Americans, making Hollywood making a movie about Ghana. It was fascinating to me. It was featuring Idris Elba, who's half Ghanaian, and I loved the movie. It was great. I enjoyed that it was a Hollywood movie about Ghana, but I would have hated it if it was forced diversity, right? It was just a
Mm.
natural movie. You wanted to tell a story, a human story, but just based in Ghana, instead of let's force Ghanaians to play white characters.
Mm, yeah. And you mentioned like the period drama stuff and all of this, how it almost undermines what was done to black people during that particular time in history. And like it is history. So how would you answer people who say that perhaps they're doing it because they want to right a wrong? They want to show the world what it should have been at that particular time. Do you think that that's their intention, or do you think that some people just say that just to kind of make it sound a bit better?
I think some people probably really mean it, and others are just lying. But what immediately I smiled when you said that but it's because they think they can tell a better story than God. They can't. God has History is God's story, and
Mm.
God's story is going to be better than Hollywood story in that way. So what I want is for them to replicate God's story.
Mm.
I want to, man. I watched one of the reasons why I love period dramas is because so often when I watch them, it'll make me want to go back and read books about that setting. Right. I watched a period drama recently called Wolf Hall, and it's really about the Reformation in the time of King Henry, and it made me read more about the Reformation and King Henry's time. So I love history, and again, history is God's story. So
Mm.
oftentimes you're really just trying to rewrite history into their own image instead of trying to affirm God's great story. And
Mm.
sadly, the reality is that slavery is part of God's story. And what's fascinating is Black Americans. And I know there's a whole issue with Florida and the Florida curriculum and everything, but the reality is slavery, as horrific as it is, and in the issue of, because it's still happening today, unfortunately, especially in Africa, that no one talks about. There are 12 million people in
Yeah.
Africa right now who are still slaves. Nevertheless, as horrific as slavery is or was, the story of also perseverance from these slaves is
Mm.
remarkable.
Mm.
I've read so much. Well, one of them was a distant relative of mine, who was 9 years old, who was taken from our family and made a slave, and she was being sent to Brazil. But then the British actually stopped it. At that point, they had abolished the slave trade. Um, and actually, no one talks about this. The African chiefs, were so angry that the British abolished the slave trade, that they were still trying forcefully to make deals with other nations to keep the slave trade alive, because we're making so much money from it.
Mm.
So actually, oftentimes the British had to go to war with some of these African chiefs to stop them from making more money from slaves. But anyway, at 9 years old, she was forced to go to Brazil, or well, on her way to Brazil, but then it was stopped by the British, and she never made it back. According to the records that I was reading, never made it back to Ghana, because it'd be very hard to send one person back to where they were from. And that story is horrific. But there are also many, many, many examples of these people still persevering. Man, not many people survived the slave ships, but
Mm.
those who did, they had to persevere, they had to overcome so much adversity. And then you see Black Americans today who were at one point the most oppressed Black people in the world, right, being made slaves. But now Black Americans are the wealthiest Black people in the world,
Mm.
right? And so many Africans desperately want to be Americans. So many of my relatives wish they could come to the US, Canada, Australia, Britain. And even though, again, the history of the slave trade is horrible, there's been so much good that has come out of that. And that's only because of God's grace, because of God's story. So so for Hollywood to think they can tell a better story than that is just horrific.
Mm.
I despise that with a passion. Simply tell good stories from God's own story.
Absolutely. Amen to that. And just out of curiosity, because like you, I'm very curious as well. Do you know what ended up happening to your 9-year-old relative? You said she couldn't make it back.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think last we know is that her ship was it arrived. I'm forgetting. I don't know if it was Sierra Leone or Benin. It arrived there, and there's nothing else that we know from her. So very likely she just had to live in a completely different nation,
Mm.
somewhat different culture, and yeah, we don't know.
Mm.
So what's fascinating is my last name Sey is it's Sey. It's very it's not really a Ghanaian name, but it's very rare even in Ghana. But there are a number of people with the same last name. So her name was also Sey,
Mm.
and there are a number of people in West Africa with the same name. So I like to think, now it was a woman, so I don't know how things played out, but I like to think that there are plenty of descendants from her across
Mm.
West Africa.
That's a nice thought, isn't it? Absolutely.
Yes, it is.
It is.
Yeah.
But that's right. There are so many incredible stories to tell. You don't need to change history to tell incredible stories. And like you said, it only takes
Amen.
away from God's glory. Then, it doesn't add to it. You can't add to it. Like you said, he has the perfect story, and it redeems
Amen.
all. Now, I'm aware of the time. We've been going for a while, but just quickly, you mentioned what's going on in Florida, and you briefly mentioned, that there's a lot of stuff going around on the internet and through the media, basically saying that the curriculum in Florida is racist because, and I think it was Kamala Harris, however you pronounce it. Basically, she did a press conference, and during her press conference, she said that the curriculum was saying slavery was good, and everyone was in the uproar. But a lot of people are saying that's not quite what the curriculum actually says. And when you actually read
Yeah.
what it says, it's not that. So are you able to get into that just briefly for me here and explain to people what's
Yeah.
happening?
So I should probably, since you mentioned what it actually says, I should probably just read it. I made a post about it, so I read it now. So this is the part that is controversial in a pretty long curriculum, right? And the curriculum is actually Well, I won't give it away, but I'll read it first, and then I'll say what I think about it. So the curriculum says that this particular course will examine the various duties and trades performed by slaves. Example: agricultural work, painting, carpentry, tailoring, domestic service, blacksmithing, transportation. Then it continues. There will be instruction. The instruction includes how slaves developed skills which in some cases could be applied for their personal benefit. That is the controversial part, supposedly, in the curriculum, especially the part about how the slaves, developed skills which in some cases could be applied for their personal benefit. Some people are trying to suggest that the curriculum is saying that slavery actually was a benefit to the slaves. Well, I guess if you were a really horrible person and you were biased and you couldn't read well, I suppose, you could make an argument that the curriculum is, well, you can't make an argument, but you could lie and say, as she is, the curriculum is trying to say that slavery was justifiable. That's not what it's saying, of course. What it's saying is a historical fact, which is that as horrific as slavery is, the slave masters did teach some of the slaves some skills which they were able to use eventually when slavery was abolished for their personal benefit. That's all it's saying. Mm-hmm. The curriculum is really a history of Black Americans. It starts from talking about African culture and even Ghana in some cases as well too, because Ghana really suffered massively from the slave trade, and talks about the African culture and some of the African stories and everything else, including going from, again, the very beginning to the end. So it goes from explaining slavery, the natures of it, how horrible it was, the economy of slavery, and then again some of the skills taught to the slaves. And then during Reconstruction, which is basically the time in between when slavery was abolished and when the U.S. was really trying to figure out what to do with these freed Black people, that what kind of jobs did these Black people have? And it was jobs that they had because of the skills that they developed from slavery. That's all it's saying. Yeah. It's a historical fact. They're not defending slavery. They're not promoting slavery. They're simply saying that despite the horrific conditions of the slave trade, that they had some of these skills which enabled them to work some jobs during Reconstruction. But unfortunately, because you have horrible people who want to divide America still, they're trying to claim that the curriculum, because you mentioned earlier about how when it comes to the issue of racism, it's always tied to a bigger story. Well, this is really about the election, because they're threatened by DeSantis. So they're trying to claim that DeSantis is a racist by endorsing and approving of this curriculum.
Yeah, it seems like no matter which way you look, like the woke mob just come after you. There's nothing you can say. There's nothing you can do. They're always hungry, always thirsty, always out for blood. You can never be too woke. And even if you are woke, if you're not woke enough, they will come for you. So they spare no one. They offer nothing. Exactly. And there is no redemption. Now, before we sort of finish off, what advice would you give to Christians who are in this space, who are faced with these sorts of things? How do we approach this respectfully to our Black brothers and sisters? How do we approach this in a way that honors God and also acknowledges that there have been abhorrent things in the past, but that through Christ, obviously, all things are made new? But so what would you say to those of us who are here and are trying to wade through the political discourse, and especially as Christians, how we kind of deal with this issue?
The first thing that comes to mind is, seem like I'm not answering the question, but I am, but I'll get to that. It's Christ is the most loving, kind, compassionate, gentle, patient, long-suffering person who ever lived. They crucified him. My point is that so often Christians are so afraid of offending people that they think there's a way for them to speak the truth without offending people. the most righteous man who ever lived, the most patient, kind man who ever lived, the only sinless person to ever live was crucified. They called him a demon. They were saying that he is evil when he is sinless. You are not greater than your master. My point is to say that just remember that no matter what you say, no matter what you do, if you are speaking the truth, if you are teaching the truth, you will offend some people. I'm Black, and people have called me racist against Black people, right? You can't escape it if you are teaching the truth. But of course, that's not an excuse to sin against people. I oftentimes tell my wife, every so often I find myself, I guess, offending people. I don't try to, but people will get offended. And my wife and I will talk about it because I don't want to be sure of myself. I want to be sure of the word of God. I always tell myself that, but I will oftentimes question, hey, what is the reason for people being offended? And I have just two questions. Is it because I've sinned, or is it because they hate the word of God? If it's because they hate the word of God, I have peace. If I've sinned, then I need in one way or another to seek forgiveness and reconciliation. All I'm trying to say is you will always be hated if you're teaching the truth. But if you're teaching the truth, make sure that you obey the word of God in teaching the truth in love, right? In being gracious. But we do so not so that we can offend people, because you will. We do so not to please people, because you can't. But you do so to please God. You do so in obedience to God. We love our neighbors because we love God first. And if you love God, you will love your neighbors. But your neighbors won't always think that your love is actually love. They'll think it's hate. But God will know that your love is real love. So that would be my advice. Just preach the word in season or out of season, but do so to please your Lord. And if you please your Lord, you will please his people as well.
Amen. That was incredibly sound advice, and even from yourself, who admits that you are a period drama lover. That was very well done, very masculine of you, and I wholeheartedly agree. But thank you so much for coming on and talking about the difficult issues with me, wading through it with me. I really appreciate it. Where can people go to follow you and follow what you write, and also your podcast?
Yeah, they can find me at slowtowrite.com. That is my blog. They can find my podcast on YouTube or wherever podcasts are available. They can also find me on all social media platforms at Slow to Write. So that's where they can find me.
Amazing. And just to finish it off, we've had this discussion when we were booking the podcast in. One of your favorite shows is also my favorite show. And we're both movie buffs, so I'm going to finish on a light note. Australian Survivor. One, is it better than American Survivor?
Absolutely. It's not even close.
I know, right? Like, we don't get many things that we definitely do Survivor better. And next question. Who is the ultimate Australian Survivor player?
Oh, that's good. It is the Golden Boy.
David.
Close to the Golden God, but David is the best. I love King George. I love King George.
King George from Bankstown.
But
you said you wanted to visit Bankstown. I'm like, no, you don't.
Yes.
You don't.
I had no idea, because I didn't know until you told me what it was really like. But those two are my favorite characters in all of Survivor. I find them incredibly fascinating. But the reason why the Golden Boy, David, is the better is he's also brilliant in strategy, but he's also better social game, and then especially the physical game, right? Challenges. George probably would have won the season, maybe even both of his seasons, if he knew how to win challenges, but he's terrible at that.
Yes.
But yet he's so great at strategy that he just dominates the game still. So, but I would take David as being the best. Who do you think?
Oh, I'm the same. David, without doubt, was my pick. And George is I'm like, in real life, I'm not sure we would get along, but I can definitely respect the Survivor hustle. Like he's really like his stuff. And it's just a physical side of it. But he did actually say for the second season that he'd went to the gym and he'd tried to, do all these things. But anyway, God bless him. Good. He tried. But for those who are not Australian and who are also not Canadian / Ghanaian / now American, you must watch this show. It is the best show ever. Highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's incredible. And honestly, too, one of the reasons why the Australian version is better, one is just the gameplay is better. But especially recently, Survivor has gone woke, the American version, and I despise it with a passion. I hate it so much. Like you have no idea how many times I roll my eyes. But I haven't seen that at all in the Australian version. It's just been pure gameplay, and I really appreciate that. So I really recommend people check it out.
Yeah, I thought on the off Australian season, because I feel like I have to wait forever for seasons in Australia. I'm like, come on, hurry up for the next one. I was like, I might try the American one. And then one of the first episodes I watched was they went to the beach and they were there and they said, what pronouns are we going to use for everybody? And someone's like, you can use they and them and this. And I was just like, I don't think I can do this. I was like, I don't think I can do this. So I pulled out of that one pretty quickly. But anyway, stay tuned for Samuel's podcast because he is going to be putting out one. Is that okay if I drop this? About Barbie.
Yes, you can.
So he's pretty much showing his cards that he is not a conservative and not a man, according to Twitter. But watch it and
well, wait, hold on here. After everything I've said, I got to defend myself here, okay? I got to say this. I have a beard, one. I work out. Though it may not seem like it, I work out. And I wrestle. I'm a wrestler, okay? So I'm a man, okay? I'm a big grizzly bear, just fearsome, shocking man. Although I might wear pink tomorrow. I'm kidding. No, I'm not. I'm not doing that.
And you have Korean drama playing in the background as you watch it. But man, I would love to interview your wife just to know what it's like in your home. I feel like this would just be full of entertainment and laughs and joy.
Oh, believe me, you don't know the half of it. I'm a weird guy. I'm a Backstreet Boys fan, huge fan. I love Taylor Swift. I'm weird, man. I don't know. But she even sometimes it's hard for her. But then whenever it's too much, I'll intentionally go grill. I love grilling as well too. And then my manhood really just comes back.
Balances itself out. Very good. Very good. Well, thank you so much again for joining me. I do hope people follow you. I appreciate your theology. You have great theology. I also enjoy your takes. I love your movie reviews and everything. And especially that you are a godly man who loves Christ, and you can see that in everything that you do. So thank you so much for joining me. And I appreciate it. And I look forward to watching your Barbie review when it comes out.
Thank you so much.